righty. And so before we get into specifics, I always like to know a little bit about how somebody reached the place professionally that they are as we're connecting. Can you talk a little bit about your professional journey?
Yeah, I would love to. And thanks for having me. I am a robotics engineer by background. I went to MIT for undergrad and grad school, studied robotics in the Department of Mechanical Engineering there. And the way I got into vehicles is basically back in 2014, I joined the early team at Cruise, the self-driving car company, startup at the time. And the way I would always pitch it to candidates, and this is, honestly what I still believe about self-driving cars, is that they will be, the most prevalent robot out in the world, sort of period. I mean, there's just so many cars out there. And more fundamentally, in especially recent years, cars are robots. I mean, they already are robots. They have sensors, they have computers, they make decisions in the real world. That's a robot. And so that's why I ultimately got excited about vehicles. So I started out in the passenger vehicle space. I also spent some time in more conventional industrial
Mm,
robotics, so all around manufacturing,
sure.
basically. A little bit of time in logistics fulfillment, sort of the more classical areas that robotics has been applied, from like the 80s, 70s, 80s onwards. Um, but I got into trucking for a couple of reasons. The big one was definitely seeing just how much fuel is used, and I definitely really care about figuring out how we can, really effectively offload from diesel use, generally fossil fuel use, to more renewable sources. Um, and the reason why I got really excited about Revoy, as I was conceptualizing the product, was it's a robot that does something pretty different to what other robots do, which is rather than doing what I call labor arbitrage, which is, take out the human, put in sensor software
Mm,
actuators, and basically make money on the difference. That's what self-driving cars do. That's
yeah.
largely what autonomous vehicles do in the trucking industry. What we do is we actually use robotics to take out the fuel source and replace it with renewable fuel sources. And that's the general crux of the business. And that's what our product is it's basically a really effective way to get renewable energy in the powertrain of diesel tractor trailers. And yeah, that's how I got there.
And because you mentioned Revoy, I actually want to stay
Yes.
there for a minute because it's both, you talked about robotics and capabilities and taking diesel out of the equation, but it's also sort of a business model play.
Hmm.
So, can you talk just a little bit about how it is that Revoy sort of aids this transition from diesel fuel to electric and trucking?
Yeah. So what Revoy does is basically offer electrification as a service. So what we've done is we've developed a novel vehicle. It's the first of its kind in terms of a vehicle type. And what it does is it integrates with any diesel semi truck on the road today, any of the 3 million in the US, and the many, many more worldwide, and in a matter of 2 minutes. And it brings in a pre-charged battery pack off of renewable power, and it dispenses that power onto the road to help move the load with the diesel truck, which lowers the power demand on the diesel truck really significantly, down to 10, maybe sometimes 5% of what it previously was doing. And in that way, just shifts the power demand over to our vehicle. So it's a very quick application of renewable power. And where the as a service model comes in is our customers show up with their existing trucks, their existing trailers, their existing payloads, and we just hop in, right, and opportunistically apply electric power. And you pay for it for however long you use it. When the battery runs out, you drop it off and swap it out for a new one. Or if you're leaving the Revoy service area, you just drop it, hook up the tractor and trailer again, go back to what's normal, and continue forward. So it's meant to be really seamless, and very flexible for drivers.
Now, it's interesting that we sort of started the conversation today talking about robotics, talking about self driving cars, and yet we're in a space talking about fleet logistics, which is hardly a new business, right? I
Hmm.
mean, more than 100 years going back, trucks moving goods around. I think in the past you described it as foundational. And so, in order to drive change, there have to be certainly regulatory changes, there have to be value orientation changes, but there also have to be mindset changes.
Hmm.
What's the thinking that needs to be explored and adopted for alternate models like the one that Revoy offers in order to take hold and really start to disrupt and change this very old space?
Yeah, yeah, and gosh, couldn't agree more on it being foundational. I mean, I think it goes even further back than 100 years, right? Like, just look at like the Silk Road, right? I mean,
Right.
freight. That was freight, right? And I mean, just look. I mean, no, undeniable how important that was to just like human history. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's not going anywhere. It's just something we're always going to be doing, and that inherently requires energy to do. And so my overall thinking on it is this: is you can't just come in guns blazing and expect that industry to want to make a huge wholesale change to their business.
Yeah.
Especially, it's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? It's currently working. It's serving the U.S. economy quite well, and so don't try to shake that up too much. And so that's the concept behind it being a additive thing to what they're already doing. So the whole concept is our swapping stations, where you pick up our vehicles or swap them out, or drop them off, are basically, they're meant to mimic a fuel stop. So, and just the only difference is that instead of hooking up a pump to the fuel tank and, pumping liquid fuel, liquid chemical energy into the fuel tank, you're hooking up a pre-charged battery pack, and that's the energy, into the tow hitch, and then having that just help move the load. So it's a different energy delivery mechanism, but in terms of the operating model, it's nearly identical. And that's really how we get this type of technology to be adopted, is to not really mess with the bones of it from the
Mhm.
get-go, and to really start changing and reforming how things are done, for the better for everyone. One, you have to make sure it's for the better for everyone, right? It's got to really serve the people adopting them. And two, because it is so foundational, you really
Yeah.
can't disrupt it that much, uh, from the get go. So a more incremental approach is going to be what's effective, in my opinion.
And yet I'm sure you've heard lots of pushback. So, Ian, I grew up on Mad Libs. I don't know if you played Mad Libs
Yeah,
growing up,
definitely.
but I thought, let's play a little supply chain Mad Libs here because I want to dig into some of the pushback and concerns that you hear as you have
Yeah,
conversations. So, operating an electric fleet or transitioning from diesel to EV powered Class 8s is too.
complicated
Is
and
that the top one that you
expensive.
tend to hear? Yeah, I was gonna say
Expensive.
expensive has to be up there.
Expensive. Yeah, that's actually the big thing, but complication is what drives that expense. Yeah.
And I think complication is hard because you say it's complicated, and
Hmm.
instantly that conjures up for me like, okay, I have some sense of what that means.
Hmm.
But tackling complicated as an obstacle is difficult because what does that mean? Like, you don't have the data, or you're concerned about the cost model, or you're worried about having conversations to explain it. To me, complicated is, while we all instantly understand it, it's also
Hmm.
so amorphous that then having that conversation, I'm sure your challenge becomes, okay, complicated how or complicated why? Is it the expense or is it something else? What tends to be at the root of that
Hmm.
perception of complexity?
Yeah. So one of the really big things is, definitely charging availability. There really isn't any for heavy trucks. I mean, we're already still, I contend that we're still really at the beginning of our journey as a
Yeah.
country for charging availability for passenger vehicles, and the power requirements for a heavy truck are, 10, 100x fold. Um, and so those types of chargers just flat out don't really exist out there on the road. And so when you're say an owner operator or a fleet or whoever it may be, someone who owns a diesel truck, and you're being asked to look into adopting an electric semi, you know, let's say, and there's a lot of complications before this, which we can talk about, but let's say you buy the truck, right? You have the truck on hand, and you go and you manage to put charging at your depot, at your yard, or your warehouse. Now you need to go and drive this somewhere, make a delivery, pick up a shipment, right?
Yeah.
What happens after that? The answer is there's no solution currently. And
Yeah.
so what trucking fleets are having to do is they're having to get into things that they've never been asked to do before. And I frankly don't think it's fair to ask them to do, which is you need to now put down, millions, if not tens of millions, to build a bunch of chargers, to get an interconnect queues for utilities, figure out transformer availability, right? Like full, new tech stacks for big construction projects. And what they want to do is they want to move loads. Like that's what they're ultimately getting paid to do. And so it's this huge, the term often calls bike shedding, right? Like to ride the bike, you need a place to store the bike, and
Yeah.
you need so ultimately what becomes a biking project is you're building a bike shed, right? It's you just get caught up in this whole world, and yeah, the big part of it is expense. And then before that, I mean, getting the truck, right? They're much more expensive. So you need to really, really carefully plan the capital for that. So yes, there are potentially lower energy costs. That's another complicating factor. Is if you do charge an electric semi at public charging, oftentimes your cost of energy will be higher than diesel. So that makes it hard to now justify a more expensive truck. And so now you say, okay, to get cheaper electricity, I need to build my own supply. But then on the truck side, the ROI is really uncertain. Not just because of the potential higher electricity costs. Even if you figure that out, these are really early, and no one really knows the full maintenance cycle of these trucks. One of the things I'm particularly concerned about is the overall cycle life of EV batteries as they're currently being implemented in the space. These things will only get about 400,000 miles with the sort of the passenger EV tech stack translated over. And that's a mismatch in terms of the end use case of the vehicles. I mean, the heritage of EVs in the passenger vehicle space, I've been very happy to see this change in the past 5 years, but historically they've been luxury products. Like the Model S is a luxury sedan, right? And all the early like OEM makers of these are always like Mercedes and Lexus, right? And or not really Lexus, but like when you copy paste that same tech stack, right? Like commercial trucks are assets and luxury sedans are not. And so there could have been poor ROI on these, or in fact, there could have been poor ROI on these luxury sedans, but there wasn't really anyone looking at it. But with a truck, they need to, like a diesel truck is expected to last 1 million miles.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking at a more expensive truck that's going to last half as long and be more expensive to charge potentially, that's really tough. And all those things can be managed, right? But that's where all the complication comes in. And so you get stuck in this quagmire of sort of fixing the electric truck, which is all being thrust onto the end user of them. Whereas the OEMs are just sort of selling them for the sticker price and making their margin there.
Well, I think your point there about the decision is interesting. When I think about consumer EV buying decisions, I'm always struck by this when I'm at my local supermarket and somebody's there with their EV that has the gull wing doors. And I'll think, really? Okay. So but the buying decision there is a novelty factor that will be an influencing factor for some people willing to pay more, almost glad they have the opportunity to pay more because then there's an exclusivity and that's part of the value proposition. Whereas when you try to translate that over to profitable trucking, I mean, yes, there's always a benefit associated with PR, maybe, right? You get to do sort of a marketing campaign around something, but that runs out of gas very quickly. You sort of pardon the expression there. And so it can't be this emotional decision. It almost has to be dispassionate. It needs to be based on the numbers because the model is going to work. And so that brings us around to the data side of this. To me, this is also part of the conversation about complexity because I'm always positive there's something more specific. Yes, complexity. Yes, we all hate change, right? Just accept that. But what really are we getting at? When companies are thinking about the data associated with the investment or any kind of infrastructure that has to be invested in, or even the routes, what are the data points that they're focused on from an operational standpoint when it comes down to equipment investment?
Mhm.
How can you sort of get down to like really towards this idea of being dispassionate? When we start talking about the data, where do you get the opportunity to focus?
Yeah, so where most people are seeing, and I think this is has a lot of legs for a couple of reasons. The biggest piece of data on routes that people look at is range, the
Yeah.
length of haul, because that's seen as one of the core limitations of battery electric vehicles, and it's true. I mean, a full electric semi will get maybe as high as 300, 400 miles, and a diesel tractor trailer fully fueled up can get 1,300, 1,500. So it's just, and a driver can be doing 500, 600 miles a day. So
Yeah.
you need there's always going to be a charge cycle in the middle. And so if you can be also at the loading dock, having things being loaded, it starts to make sense. And so they're looking a lot at short haul. Short and regional haul is where early traction in electric vehicles, especially in freight, is happening
Yeah.
because of that. Now, there's another reason that actually makes that, in my opinion, a bit of a dead end. But that is the first bit of data that people look at. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I think most of the stories where I've read about significant uptake is drayage. Like,
Yes.
you're not going far, and that's the
Exactly.
whole point, and it makes it much easier to make that decision.
Yep.
As you start to think about the changing mindset and sort of this alternate option that you're talking about, where the decision-making process is a little different around the equipment, and we're not putting all of the infrastructure responsibility onto the carrier, what types of routes or what forms of freight service do you think start to come into the picture as
Mhm.
we shift from this, okay, we're accepting that either from a mileage standpoint or a time frame standpoint, these EV Class 8s can only go so far. And so, okay, we're just going to use it for drayage. But as we start to think about it differently, what's sort of the next wave of
Mhm.
opportunity that comes into the picture?
Yeah. So yeah, I think you touched on another bit of data that people think about a lot, which is the weight of their loads.
Yeah.
So another thing that's well known about EVs is that they weigh significantly more. I think the curb weight of the Cybertruck is like 8,000 pounds, maybe 10,000 pounds. It's really high.
Yeah.
It's because batteries are really heavy. And with freight, I mean, cargo weight is what you're getting paid to move. So, and there is a hard limit of 80,000 pounds for everyone. For electric vehicles, they get an extra 2,000 pounds. It's not enough. And so this does limit the types of things that heavy trucks can haul just inherently. You're looking at, on average, somewhere between 7 to 10,000 pounds of lost payload when you're running with an electric semi. Um, and that actually makes drayage a little bit tough, because drayage is actually one of the heaviest sectors.
Mm.
You can compensate for that basically by having a very short range truck, but then it can only be used in drayage. So I do think there is an opportunity there. Where I think there's a problem with short and regional haul is when it comes down to electricity price. The trouble with that is that you're doing these things in very high demand, high electricity demand areas,
Yeah.
city centers, industrial areas, right? And so the rate you're going to get on your electricity is going to be much higher than the equivalent diesel cost. So it ends up being just end to end more expensive to happen. And it's really being driven by mandates right now. There was a mandate that I haven't checked on it lately, but it was supposed to happen early in January of this year at California ports. Basically, no new ICE trucks can be
Yeah.
registered to go into ports. Enforcement had been delayed. I'm not sure if it's been delayed to the present day, July 2024. But the big challenge there is cost, also availability of the trucks. But yeah, getting outside of the port. Yeah, it tends to be lighter goods. A little bit of a joke in the industry is, oh, well, electrics, they haul potato chips, and that's mostly. I mean,
And those bags are all half empty anyway. So
exactly,
yeah.
they're puffed up of air. It's also because one of the early really big successes for the Tesla semi has been Frito-Lay. And so yeah, that's kind of the joke with it. And it's true. I mean, you can't haul as many goods.
Mm,
Liquids, beer, sodas, those types of things, petroleum. You're just not going to be able to
yeah.
haul that for any reasonable distance with an electric semi. Um,
Yeah.
just flat out. Yeah.
Now, you had made the comment earlier, and I completely agree with you that as much progress as we've made, we are still very early days on this journey. Right? And just to draw sort of a historical comparison, I think about the first few flying machines, right? They all look sort of like large sick birds or maybe a helicopter missing half of it, right? I have a feeling 50, 100 years from now, people far wiser than you and I, Ian, are going to look back and say, oh my gosh, can you believe they drove those? They thought this was going to work. And yet, the journey of 1,000 miles, right?
Hmm.
One step at a time. If we're at the beginning and we're trying to drive change at scale beyond sort of what's most approachable given the technology that we have today, when we think about this split between, okay, well, there's the trucks versus the infrastructure that needs to be put in place, where is the best opportunity to really start driving systemic change in the transition to EV freight?
Yeah, so it's a big challenge, honestly. I think one of the big blockers to just adoption in general, and this was true for passenger vehicles as well, was the charger vehicle chicken egg problem.
Mm,
It's the reason why Tesla built the supercharger network in California as well as other parts of the country. Which it's basically it's what we were talking about earlier, which is you buy an electric truck or an electric car and you go to drive it and you need to be pretty sure that you can get it recharged to be able to come home or do the next
yeah.
thing. And you could be taking that vehicle anywhere um, from the perspective of the manufacturer, right? Like you're selling it to someone in San Jose and they could be going any number of places. And
Mhm.
so you have to have this critical mass of infrastructure, charging infrastructure, to get people to even consider buying one. And without somebody basically going out and building that infrastructure at cost with low utilization to start, uh, it just won't start happening. And that's what we're seeing in commercial semis. Like there's less than 1,000 electric or really zero emission semis. Some of them are actually hydrogen right now, and it's basically stalled out. And the product's been out for almost a decade now.
Yeah.
Like it's not actually that new of a product. And so, yeah, when it comes to unsticking, the problem, the biggest thing for sort of the classical model of replace, do the same thing but electric, maybe is a good way to describe it. Just replace the diesel semi with an electric semi is there has to be a lot of infrastructure built.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you're seeing so many federal incentives for doing that is, it's something that's recognized that needs to happen. And so rather than expecting private business to go and take a huge amount of risk of building charging without any vehicles to come and use it and actually get revenues on it, you need to have some governmental assistance. So I think it just as a whole, that's the big thing that needs to happen is we need to start making a network of charging stations to get people to start buying these vehicles. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So if those federal incentives are the carrot, we do, of
Hmm.
course, also have the stick. And doesn't everybody love a mandate, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
we've got, California is passing mandates. And if for no other reason than because of their role with LA and Long Beach, right, they can have sort of an outsized impact on the change being driven in this space. But there's also mandates coming down from the EPA.
Hmm.
I'm eager to hear, both in terms of your knowledge of this space, but also as somebody who's trying to build a business in this area. I'm
Hmm.
eager to hear your thoughts about regulation. How
Hmm.
effective have they been so far in driving the desired change versus sort of the incentive winning hearts and minds kind of approach?
Hmm. Hmm. I would say varied success. So we can kind of maybe talk about the highlights and maybe some of the lowlights. So highlights, I think the EPA rules are very good. I think they are reasonable. It's not a wholesale drive to zero emissions.
Yep.
It's a significant reduction, but with some acceptance that it's going to take time. and we're not going to wholesale rip out diesel from the supply chain in that time frame. And I think that's really reasonable. And most importantly, it is not prescriptive when it comes to technology.
Right.
The rules are emissions need to get to this level, private industry figure it out. And I think that's a very fair way to do it. In terms of lowlights, I do think there are other, and I probably won't name names here, but there are other other programs where it is, in my opinion, overly prescriptive. Basically saying you must buy this type of vehicle, you must do this type of thing, which I think is it's counter to the goals of what everybody's trying to do. If we want to lower emissions, which is ultimately what all of this is trying to do, let's regulate emissions, right? And let's let the private sector do what we do best, which is innovate to meet those goals. And let's look at all possible technologies and just figure out what wins in the market. I think that's going to be what's going to be most successful. So I am quite bullish on the EPA rules. I think those are going to be really good.
And I agree with you about the EPA rules. And in fact, for anybody that's joined us that isn't familiar, basically they've said, and Ian, you can correct me, you have to reduce your emissions by X. But I mean, we don't really care how you do it as long as you do it on the timeline. So wild example, but if you wanted to scale down your business, if you wanted to start using horses, there's on the sort of crazy end, but it does open the door to innovation because whoever can take these guidelines and say, okay, given what we need to do to be profitable and given the reduction that we need to achieve on what kind of time frame, let's just blue skies ideate. What are all the different ways we could hit these targets? And somebody's going to figure out the best way to do it. And maybe in an even better case scenario, a couple of somebodies figure out really good ways to do it, and they sort of battle it out to improve the system even further. Do you think that's a fair sort of explanation of what the EPA has rolled out?
Yep, absolutely. One nice thing about it too is it's in steps, right? So it's not this far off goal right now. It's this much by this year, and steadily bringing things down. So it's not a shock to the system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the other key factor here that we haven't talked about yet is the role of driver, because certainly fuel is a major cost, infrastructure, equipment is a major cost, but driver retention is a massive concern. And there's been a lot of shakeups in different parts of the logistics space, right? We saw yellow freight go away. We've seen Teamsters renegotiations of the UPS contract. So companies are also looking at what they're paying to have good, reliable drivers on staff and how to retain them once they've hired. What are you hearing about their preferences and the impact that has in this transition?
Yeah, so on a really basic level, in terms of what it feels like to drive an electric truck, reviews are rave reviews, right? And it's the same experience people have when the first time they drive an electric passenger vehicle. Is there's a lot of torque at the low end, and it feels very nimble and safer for that reason, but just more fun to drive. So for those reasons, drivers really like drive. They're quiet too. They're less vibration. You don't have this loud vibrating, thing with exploding cylinders. It's just a low electric whir. And that's another actually safety thing. Vibration and noise is a big contributor to fatigue. So if you're driving for 11 hours, if you don't have to listen to an engine, rev that entire time, that will make you more alert by the end of it. So that's one part of it. There's one of the downsides is, for example, and it kind of depends on who's actually footing the bill for this.
Sure.
But the charge cycle is really punishing. You're going to have to do 2, maybe 3 charges per day on an electric vehicle if you could do it instantaneously. In the end, you only get 1 or 2 because you end up getting outside of your hours of service. People don't know there's a 14-hour window where you get 11 hours of driving and it resets every 24 hours. And if you are charging for, 2, 3, 4 hours of that, you could imagine that would eat into your earnings quite a bit. If you are, for example, an owner operator where your time on the road is how you get paid. on the sort of company driver standpoint, oftentimes if they're getting paid by the load, then yeah, the driver is footing that bill, that sort of opportunity cost. If they're getting paid by the hour, well, then the company's paying to have a driver sit and wait for something to charge. So that's one of the downsides, is it just the amount of downtime that it takes. Same goes for the payload reduction. Similar deal. It's just sort of on the other end. You just need to
Yeah.
move more trucks to move the same amount of cargo. And so and ultimately what it comes down to is cost. Ryder put out a really awesome report. I think it's very, very accurate when they're talking about what they call the TCT, the total cost of transportation, when it comes to just a status quo diesel versus an electric semi. And when you factor in the additional labor you need, the additional equipment you need, and even with a energy discount, right, you're looking at actually double the cost
Yeah.
in terms of total cost of transportation. And that is untenable. You cannot operate a successful business on that model. If your competition is not going electric and pricing at half your price, I mean, gosh, that's a hard thing for a shipper to justify. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as we start to sort of wrap this up, I actually want to go back to our supply chain Mad Libs for a sec, because
Yeah.
you're having these conversations all the time. So we've talked about, complexity is sort of that initial thought, and then maybe you hear it's too expensive. As you start to dig down in, it gets to things like concerns around distance, or concerns around access to charging stations,
Hmm.
or concerns around restrictions on load weight, or the capacity of a shipment. What do you find are the most effective way to address those concerns and maybe even dispel myths at the same time? Somebody reads an article maybe 18 months ago that is a really, unfavorable review. Things are changing incredibly fast. What do you find are the points that are the most effective, even if they don't necessarily win somebody over instantly to, yes, okay, I'm going to do this, to start opening their mind to
Hmm.
understand how all of this, in fact, can work?
Yeah. I think that the high level point is that trucking is not a monolith. It is so diverse. There are many, many ways that trucks get used. I mean, it's really a general purpose piece of equipment.
Yeah.
It hauls things on a trailer, and so it can be used for a lot of different things. Um, and so there is sort of this conception of the big rig hauling always 80,000 pounds, and there's
Yeah.
no opportunity for electric. This is one sort of misconception I would love to help dispel, which is the vast majority of tractor trailers are not weighing out. In fact, it's not even just the vast majority, like 90% are, I believe, are below 75,000 pounds. It's a crazy number. In terms of, for example, our vehicle adds 22,000 pounds, and we're one of the few companies that will actually say that because of how sensitive weight is in the
Yeah.
industry. That only actually reduces your payloads that you can haul by 30%, 35%. And what the to get into sort of the nuts and bolts of Revoy, the way we tackle the weight problem is actually wholly different from how electric vehicles have been tackling it thus far. Which is, when you're replacing the diesel tractor, or there's actually some interesting stuff on the trailer end where they're replacing trailers with batteries and electric powertrains. So basically, moving the battery over to the trailer. In either of these cases, what it is it's a permanent addition of a battery, and that means permanent payload reduction. So that truck can no longer haul
Right.
what they can. And there's this what I call a implicit social contract in trucking, which is if you put 45,000 pounds of cargo in that trailer, anybody can haul it. And with electric vehicles, either in the trailer or in the
Mm.
truck, that contract is now violated. And so you now need to, it's almost like operating a second fleet, right? Like you have to not, you have to send it to different charging places.
Right.
You have to load it differently, right? It's like a totally different piece of equipment. It's not actually a true replacement. So anyways, what we do is we apply our electric power trip by trip. And that's all enabled by this, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off technology. So what we do is we actually go up to the trailer and we weigh it. We give it a little shimmy, right? You get the weight of the trailer,
Yeah.
and if it's too heavy, you drop it. and then diesel hooks up to it, you just go with diesel. And that'll be 35% of the time.
Yeah.
The other 65% of the time, well, great, you can reduce your diesel bill by 95%. And so this idea of, trucking not being a monolith means we don't need to have sort of a one size fits all approach to it, right? And that's what makes the electric semi so hard, is that we're trying to make it work for every single load, and you're running into this really hard engineering and science problem of how do we get more energy into batteries so that we don't have to have them weigh so much to get a reasonable range. Whereas with this modular approach we've come up with, you no longer need to worry about that. You just do the ones that work right now, and then don't do the ones that don't work. And so that's really important. Another misconception I would really like to dispel as well is, and this is one not internal to the trucking industry, this is more for people externally coming into the trucking industry. There's this statistic that gets thrown around, which is 84% of trucking is 250 miles or below. This is an argument made that when basically making the argument that electric trucks can do short and regional haul, and that's actually just good enough. That's all they'll ever need to do. The trouble is that this is actually a very skewed way to look at that data. So that 84% is by trip count. So what that means is that a 10-mile trip counts the same as a 1,000-mile trip. And when we're talking about energy use, right, fuel use, which is what the energy transition from diesel to electric power is, it's miles. It's not trips. Trips is sort of like a weird denominator on that. And so when you actually look at it by number of miles, it's the opposite. The industry is dominated by long haul. And you ask anyone in trucking, long haul is the most important thing in trucking. And so we really need to be focusing on long haul. And right now, pre-Revoy, there actually weren't really any good solutions. It was something that was deemed far too hard for electric vehicles, for battery electric vehicles. We need hydrogen to make it happen. And so part of our goal with Revoy is to make, we exclusively focus on long haul. We do not do any of that drayage short haul stuff. We just leave it to everybody else. We focus on long haul. And the way we do long haul is via the swap. So if you can, our take on range is, the range itself is not what matters. It's the charge cycle at the end.
Yeah.
So if you can make that charge cycle really, really fast, well, you can go arbitrarily far on electric power. If you had an electric semi that could recharge in 5 minutes, well, no one would be worried about long haul.
Right.
Exactly. So what we've actually been able to do is create a electric semi truck that can recharge, quote unquote, in 5 minutes. And the way you do that is you charge it on the back end, and then you pre-charge another battery on another vehicle and swap it out. And that's what our vehicle does. So those are the two big misconceptions that I like to talk about. And yeah, I think those need to be wider known, because the other thing about long haul too is that out in where long haul happens, which is rural communities in the US, you don't have this demand problem on electricity. And so you can actually get much better electricity rates and actually do a lot of on-site generation that really drops your cost of power. And so that's why I think long haul is the much better market to go after for electric trucks, and why I actually view short haul drayage and regional haul as a little bit of a dead end, just because it's going to be borderline impossible to make that economical compared to diesel, whereas it is possible in long haul.
And it's also why it's so important for us to be specific, right? When you talk about some of those data points, like, okay, but let's just, there was a commercial that used to be on TV, and of course now I've forgotten, but it was, 35% of all statistics are 85% made up, right? Like maybe a cable company. But this idea that you can always come up with a data point that will serve your motivation.
Yes.
But is that data point representative?
Yes.
Is it forward-looking, or is it stuck in the past? And so starting to think differently and looking at the right data points, but also acknowledging where you need to be flexible. To your point, is in fact this trailer too heavy? Then this is the one where we're going to hook up diesel, right? Not being stuck where you can't move a load, at least at this stage in the journey. as the hearts and minds get one, and as we innovate some of these different solutions and move over to the right analytics, building in that flexibility and being transparent about it, I think is so incredibly critical.
I agree.
Um,
I agree.
and this is a really interesting conversation. I appreciate everything that you've shared. We're definitely
Thank
going to
you.
stay in touch because I have a feeling the
Yeah.
speed at which things are changing in a year, 18 months, things are probably going to be drastically different. If
You bet there
people
will
are
be.
meeting you or hearing about Revoy for the first time in this conversation, what is the best way for them to reach out and learn more or connect with you?
Absolutely. I mean, top level, if you want to learn more about Revoy, just head to revoy.com, revoy.com. Also, feel free to just email me directly. I'm at Ian at revoy.com. And I'd love to hear from you. I love hearing from people. So please reach out.
Awesome. Ian, thank you so much for being with me today.